The heavy bronze doors of the Palatine Palace creak open. Torches burn along the marble walls, casting shadows that dance like restless spirits. Inside, Rome's most feared man, Emperor Caligula, awaits, and what lies beyond those doors would leave even hardened Roman senators whispering in terror. These were not just feasts, not just banquets. They were nights of ritual humiliation where sex, violence, and power fused into one monstrous display. What happened here was so shocking, so obscene, that Roman historians struggled to put it into words without staining their own honor. Tonight, we enter the secret chambers of Caligula, the place where sexuality was transformed into cruelty, where forbidden practices turned into instruments of control. To the Roman elite, pleasure was never innocent. It was political currency, a weapon, and sometimes a death sentence. But before we descend into the shadows of Caligula's chambers, we must understand the world that made such horrors possible. Ancient Rome was an empire obsessed with spectacle, from gladiatorial bloodshed in the Colosseum to the whispered gossip in marble atriums. Public life was a theater of dominance, and private life was no different. In an age without our modern sense of morality, sex was not simply intimacy, it was hierarchy. Who penetrated and who was penetrated, who gave and who submitted. These dynamics defined power, respect, and humiliation. Imagine the city itself. It is the year 37 CE. Rome is at its glittering height, a metropolis of 1 million souls. Senators stride in crimson-trimmed togas, gladiators bleed in the sand, and slaves carry the weight of the empire on their backs. Yet behind the stone facades and marble columns, a world of secrecy unfolds. A world where emperors could turn their private chambers into theaters of unthinkable decadence. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, did not rise to power in a vacuum. His reign followed the long shadow of Tiberius, a man whose own retreat to the island of Capri had already stained Rome with stories of sexual perversion and cruelty. By the time Caligula ascended to the throne, Rome had learned that emperors were not merely rulers. They were gods in flesh, and gods in the Roman imagination could take whatever they desired. The young emperor was adored at first. He was the son of the beloved General Germanicus, a symbol of Rome's military might. But admiration soon turned to horror. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread. Caligula did not merely break Rome's sexual taboos, he shattered them with theatrical cruelty. Where others had mistresses, he took the wives of senators openly. Where others enjoyed lavish feasts, he turned dining halls into brothels. Where others sought loyalty, he demanded humiliation. Acts so shocking that Rome's historians, from Suetonius to Cassius Dio, preserved them in trembling ink. The pleasure chambers were not simply about desire, they were about domination. Every scandal, every depraved ritual was a way for Caligula to remind Rome that he was untouchable, that no law, no taboo, no moral code could restrain him. He had power over bodies, over reputations, even over the very definition of shame. And shame in Roman society was often worse than death. But what were these rituals? What did they look like? And why did they strike such terror into the heart of Rome? Over the next hour, we will peel back the veil on one of the darkest corners of human history, where politics, sex, and cruelty collided. We will explore the twisted psychology of an emperor who turned pleasure into punishment. We will uncover the scandals that shook the empire to its core. And we will ask, were these horrors unique to Caligula, or do they reveal something deeper about Rome itself? And perhaps even about us? Because the truth is this: the world of Caligula is not as distant as we like to imagine. For in every age, power has used intimacy as its sharpest weapon. And while the chambers of Rome may be long buried, the echoes of those forbidden practices still haunt the corridors of modern politics, celebrity, and scandal. But to understand just how horrific Caligula's pleasure chambers became, we must first grasped the Roman belief that desire itself was never private. It was public, political, and above all, dangerous. And the real shock is still to come. In Rome, desire was never simply a private indulgence. It was the raw currency of dominance, a mirror of hierarchy, and a language of control that reached from the emperor's palace down to the slave markets. To understand why Caligula's chambers horrified even his own contemporaries, we must first examine the Roman belief that sex was about power, not pleasure. For the Romans, masculinity was defined not by who one loved, but by who one controlled. To penetrate, whether in the bedroom or on the battlefield, was to assert superiority. To be penetrated was to submit, to fall into the role of the conquered. Thus, sexual relations were political allegories, lived out on bodies. A senator might be untouchable in the forum, yet if Caligula forced his wife into the emperor's bed, or worse, summoned the senator himself to debasement, the act was a public execution of status. The emperor did not need the sword to humiliate. His weapon was desire, wielded in ritualized cruelty. Concubines and mistresses had long been part of Rome's elite culture. Emperors before Caligula kept harems, but discretion was key. Caligula obliterated discretion. He made intimacy into theatre, summoning noblewomen to his chambers in front of their husbands, turning the act of seduction into a public performance of dominance. Roman writers record with disgust how he would parade these women, appraising their bodies in front of the Senate as though they were livestock at an auction. The message was clear: your wives, your daughters, your honor, all belong to me. Yet it was not only women who became instruments in this economy of humiliation. Male slaves, actors, and even noblemen were forced into roles that shattered traditional taboos. To Caligula, the very shock of reversing roles was the point. He inverted hierarchies to remind Rome that nothing was sacred, that under his reign, power was fluid, dangerous, and entirely dependent on his whims. Those who once ruled found themselves stripped, mocked, and reduced to objects of his perverse amusement. But why did such displays strike terror into Rome's heart? Because the Romans themselves had long feared the subversive power of unchecked desire. Philosophers like Seneca warned of passion as a disease of the soul, capable of unraveling the very fabric of discipline and order upon which Rome was built. A soldier who gave in to lust was seen as weak, unreliable in the face of war. A senator who lost control of his household's honor was unworthy of power. Sexuality in this sense was never separate from politics. It was its shadow. Caligula understood this all too well. He weaponized Rome's fears, transforming his chambers into stages where taboos were not just broken, but flaunted. He summoned married women and auctioned them off to the highest bidder at his banquets. He demanded that noblemen offer their daughters or sisters, forcing the Senate to watch as private bonds were destroyed in public shame. Every ritual reinforced one truth: Rome belonged not to its laws, nor to its traditions, but to the appetite of one man. Religion, too, was not spared. Caligula declared himself a living god, demanding worship as Jupiter incarnate. In doing so, he merged sexual power with divine authority. His chambers became not just a brothel, but a blasphemous temple, where sacrilege and seduction mingled. To refuse him was to defy a god. To obey him was to sacrifice dignity at the altar of survival. Priests whispered of omens, commoners trembled, but few dared speak aloud what everyone knew: that Rome's moral order was rotting from its highest seat. And yet, Caligula was not an aberration. Across the ancient world, rulers used sexuality as a language of control. In Sparta, boys were initiated into adulthood through ritualized relations with older warriors. In the courts of Persia, eunuchs guarded harems, their bodies made symbols of loyalty and submission. Among the Vikings, marriage was often less about love and more about alliances, sealed through the exchange of brides as political currency. In each case, intimacy was chained to power, reinforcing hierarchies through flesh. What made Caligula so terrifying was not that he invented this system, but that he stripped away its restraints. Where others cloaked their rituals in religion or tradition, he displayed his cruelty openly, forcing Rome to confront the raw brutality of power unmasked. His chambers were not hidden temples or private harems. They were theaters of domination, where every kiss, every forced union, every whispered humiliation carried the weight of empire. But even in this dark world of controlled desire, there were limits, fragile lines that even Rome's emperors were expected not to cross. And Caligula, drunk on his own godhood, would cross them all. Because soon, the whispers of scandal would grow into open outrage, and the true horrors of his pleasure chambers, the scandals that would stain his reign forever, were only just beginning. The night begins like any other. Senators gather in the marble halls of the Palatine, expecting a banquet of wine, roasted meats, and idle conversation. But Caligula, Rome's self-declared god, has something else planned. At the height of the feast, he signals for silence. A curtain is drawn, revealing couches arranged in the style of a brothel. Noble women, wives of Rome's most powerful men, are summoned forward. One by one, Caligula inspects them like merchandise, commenting on their breasts, their hips, their voices. Senators shift uneasily, torn between fury and fear. Then the emperor makes his pronouncement, "These women are for sale. The highest bidder among Rome's elite may take them," with Caligula as the auctioneer. This was not rumor. Suetonius records it with disgust. Caligula turned the nobility of Rome into spectacle, their private lives into a marketplace. What should have been sacred, the honor of family, the dignity of marriage, became a public humiliation ritual. Husbands could not object, for to protest was to risk death. In this single act, Caligula shattered the fragile boundary between Rome's public honor and private desire. But the auction was only the beginning. His chambers became infamous for scenes that even Roman writers struggled to capture. One story tells of Caligula bedding his own sisters, Drusilla, Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, not in secret, but openly, flaunting the incest as though it were proof of his divinity. Drusilla, the sister he adored most, was treated as his empress, paraded through Rome in ways that mocked both religion and morality. For the Romans, incest was not just taboo, it was sacrilege, an abomination that threatened the very favor of the gods. Yet Caligula dared to make it central to his reign. The scandal deepened when he transformed the imperial palace itself into a brothel. According to Cassius Dio, he converted a section of the palace into rooms where noble women and men alike were forced to serve as prostitutes. Patrons, senators, merchants, even foreigners were invited to purchase them, the profits flowing directly into Caligula's treasury. To the emperor, this was not only debauchery, it was political theater. By forcing Rome's elite to participate in prostitution, he stripped them of dignity, reducing them to commodities beneath his gaze. The palace, the very seat of Roman power, became a house of shame. Yet the most chilling element was the psychology behind it all. Caligula's chambers were not simply about indulgence, they were about breaking people. Witnesses describe the emperor demanding acts that reversed all norms, senators humiliated before their slaves, generals forced into roles of submission, sacred virgins desecrated in public. He inverted Rome's hierarchies, turning its social order upside down, then laughed as the most powerful men in the empire groveled at his feet. In his chambers, power itself became pornography. Perhaps the most infamous scandal came with his sister Drusilla's death in 38 CE. Overcome with grief, Caligula ordered her to be deified, elevating her as a goddess. Whispers spread that he had not merely loved her, but claimed her as a wife in all but name. Whether these tales were exaggerations or truth mattered little. To the Romans, the implication was horrifying. The emperor had not only defiled family, but blurred the lines between mortal intimacy and divine worship. What was once forbidden became ritual, a mockery of religion and family alike. But Caligula's cruelty extended beyond sex into terror. One chilling tale tells of a dinner party where he suddenly ordered guests' children to be executed before their eyes as punishment for whispered dissent. In other accounts, he forced senators to watch as their wives were defiled, daring them to show resistance. To survive his chambers, one had to endure humiliation silently. Resistance was death. Compliance was degradation. It was a world with no escape. And yet the most shocking element was the aftermath. Rome did not collapse after these scandals, not immediately. Senators still attended his banquets, soldiers still obeyed, and the people still cheered at his games. The empire itself seemed to tolerate the horror, as though Rome had grown numb to its own corruption. This tolerance reveals a deeper truth, that societies can endure unthinkable practices so long as they are draped in the cloak of power. But cracks were forming. Whispers turned to curses, loyalty to resentment. For while Rome could endure spectacle, it could not endure endless humiliation. Caligula had crossed boundaries too often, too publicly. What began as a scandal was becoming rebellion. And soon, the emperor's chambers would not be his fortress, but his tomb. Power in Rome was rarely decided on the battlefield alone. It was forged in whispers, in bedchambers, and in the dark bargains struck between desire and ambition. For Caligula, the act of sex was never isolated from politics. Every scandal, every humiliation in his chambers rippled outward into the Senate, the military, and the very stability of the empire. The pleasure chamber was not only a site of indulgence, it was a crucible of political intrigue. Consider the senators who attended his banquets. These were not merely passive observers of debauchery. They were unwilling pawns in a performance of dominance. Caligula knew their vulnerabilities. He could seduce their wives in front of them, then force them to applaud as though it were a divine blessing. A senator who resisted could be accused of treason, his lands confiscated, his life cut short by the Praetorian Guard. The humiliation was deliberate, a reminder that political survival depended not on oratory or law, but on submission to the emperor's appetite. Caligula also wielded mistresses as weapons. Ancient Rome had long tolerated powerful men keeping concubines, but Caligula used these relationships to destabilize his enemies. By taking a senator's wife or daughter as his mistress, he entangled powerful families in webs of scandal. Rumors spread like poison. Was the senator complicit? Was he a cuckold? Did his rise in politics come through his wife's degradation? Even if untrue, such whispers corroded reputations. Caligula understood that honor in Rome was fragile, and once broken, it could never be restored. But the emperor's sexual intrigues extended beyond the aristocracy. He manipulated alliances by controlling access to his chambers, rewarding loyalty with participation in his debauched rituals. Generals and provincial governors found themselves caught in the spectacle. Those who played along gained temporary favor. Those who hesitated found their careers ruined. One story suggests that Caligula even used soldiers in his private games, commanding them to act out obscene performances for the amusement of his court. In doing so, he reminded the empire that even Rome's military strength bent beneath his will. Religion too became a stage for his sexual politics. When Caligula declared himself a living god, he blurred the boundaries between temple and chamber. He demanded that sacrifices be made not only at altars, but in his own bed. To worship him was to indulge his appetites. Priests who resisted risked exposure, scandal, or death. In this way, he weaponized both sacred ritual and forbidden desire, dismantling the moral structures that had long underpinned Rome's identity. The emperor's body became the new altar, and Rome's elite became its unwilling sacrifices. This intertwining of sex and politics bred conspiracies. Some senators sought to use Caligula's excesses against him, leaking rumors to discredit his reign. Yet even here, his chambers served as both shield and sword. By involving nearly everyone of importance in his scandals, whether willingly or by force, Caligula ensured that few could speak out without condemning themselves. Who would dare accuse the emperor of incest when they themselves had been seen partaking in his feasts of humiliation? His chambers became a trap, a silken net binding Rome's elite in silence. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment grew. Every senator forced to watch his wife humiliated, every general stripped of dignity, every noblewoman auctioned off, all carried the memory of shame like a hidden dagger. These private humiliations became the seeds of betrayal, the very politics Caligula manipulated through sexual power plays were beginning to turn against him. History offers echoes of this pattern beyond Rome. In the courts of medieval France, mistresses shifted the balance of kingdoms. In the harems of the Ottoman Empire, concubines and eunuchs shaped succession through whispered intrigues. In China's Forbidden City, emperors' intimate lives dictated the rise and fall of dynasties. Again and again, the private desires of rulers became the fault lines upon which empires cracked. Caligula was not unique in his methods, but his reckless exposure of them made him uniquely dangerous. By the year 40 CE, Rome was choking under the weight of scandal. Senators conspired in shadows, soldiers muttered in their camps, and commoners whispered of blasphemy. The pleasure chambers, once symbols of unchallengeable dominance, had become symbols of Rome's rot. Every new humiliation carried political consequences. Death. For all the depravity of Caligula's chambers, his behavior did not erupt from a vacuum. Rome itself was a society built on sexual double standards, where intimacy was less about affection and more about status. To understand the true horror of Caligula's reign, we must step outside the palace and look at the everyday lives of Romans, for their world was already primed to accept shocking contradictions. In the daily life of a Roman household, sex was inseparable from hierarchy. Husbands wielded near total power over wives, slaves, and children. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, could dictate who married, who bore children, and who was discarded. Marriages among the elite were rarely about love. They were contracts, political tools to secure alliances or property. A noblewoman might be paraded as a dutiful wife in public, yet privately she was often reduced to an object of exchange. Her body, her dowry, even her reputation, all were controlled by men. Slavery deepened this dynamic. The Roman Empire thrived on millions of enslaved people, and with them came an entire system of sexual exploitation. Household slaves were expected to submit to their master's desires, with no legal protection against abuse. For a Roman elite, possessing slaves meant possessing bodies, young men and women who could be used at will. To the Romans, this was not scandal. It was daily life. Writers like Juvenal and Martial even joked about it, normalizing a culture where domination and humiliation were built into intimacy itself. Yet, for all this permissiveness, strict lines existed. Roman men could take slaves, concubines, or prostitutes without scorn, so long as they maintained the role of penetrator, the dominant partner. To be passive was to invite ridicule, to risk one's honor. For women, the double standard was even harsher. A noblewoman accused of promiscuity could be divorced, disgraced, or even executed. Thus, while elite men flaunted their affairs, elite women were crushed beneath the weight of expectation. The streets of Rome reflected this hypocrisy. Brothels lined the city, filled with enslaved prostitutes. Graffiti scrawled on the walls of Pompeii offers crude records of encounters, names of favored prostitutes, even explicit boasts. Sexual commerce was everywhere, cheap, public, and unapologetic. Yet the same society that tolerated rampant prostitution condemned women of high status if they dared to step outside strict norms. The lower the class, the more disposable the body. The higher the class, the more fragile the honor. This hypocrisy is what made Caligula's chambers especially terrifying. He blurred the very boundaries that structured Roman life. By humiliating noblewomen publicly, he treated them as prostitutes. By degrading senators, he stripped away the illusion of masculine dominance. By desecrating family bonds through incest, he mocked the sanctity of the Roman household. His crimes were shocking precisely because they turned Rome's hypocrisies inside out. And yet, ordinary Romans were not immune to fascination. Rumors of the emperor's excesses spread like wildfire. For the common people, scandal at the top was entertainment, a grotesque theatre mirroring the gladiatorial games. Bread and circuses were not limited to the arena. They spilled into gossip about who the emperor had defiled, what nobleman had been shamed, what sacred taboo had been smashed. Outrage mingled with thrill. The empire's moral outrage was real, but so was its voyeurism. Religion, too, reflected these contradictions. Rome's pantheon was filled with gods who blurred sexual norms. Jupiter disguised himself to seduce mortals. Venus embodied lust itself. Bacchus presided over orgiastic rites. Festivals like the Floralia encouraged public nudity and licentiousness. To Romans, the gods themselves modeled both excess and transgression. Thus, when Caligula proclaimed himself divine and indulged in shocking rituals, he was not creating something entirely alien. He was amplifying what already lurked beneath Rome's culture: desire without restraint, dominance without limits. Still, the common people did draw lines. Sexuality tied to politics was dangerous. They could tolerate brothels, taverns, and festivals, but when emperors corrupted family, honor, and religion, it shook the social order itself. Daily life depended on illusion, the illusion that noble families upheld virtue, that senators embodied dignity, that the empire was guided by gods. When Caligula mocked those illusions too openly, the whole society felt the tremor. This is why his chambers became infamous. Not because Romans were strangers to exploitation, but because he exposed what they preferred to keep hidden. He forced the entire empire to stare into the mirror of its own hypocrisies, and what they saw was too horrific to endure. For soon, the culture that tolerated slavery, brothels, and humiliation would recoil in disgust at the emperor's excess. And in that recoil, Rome itself would reach a breaking point. Because every society, no matter how permissive, has a threshold, and Caligula was about to cross it. Every reign of terror has its breaking point. For Caligula, the spectacle of humiliation and forbidden rituals could only stretch so far before the very machinery of Rome, senators, soldiers, priests, turned against him. The pleasure chambers that once cemented his dominance became the crucible of his downfall. The turning point was not just one scandal, but a chain of excesses that bled into betrayal, rebellion, and ultimately assassination. By the year 40 CE, the emperor's appetites had become intolerable. His incest with his sisters, his open auction of noblewomen, his desecration of temples, each outrage stacked upon the last. But perhaps most dangerous was the way he flaunted his disdain for Rome's institutions. He mocked the Senate openly, calling senators his slaves. He demanded to be worshipped not just as a god, but as the equal of Jupiter himself. When priests hesitated, he threatened them with execution. Caligula was no longer simply breaking taboos in private. He was dismantling Rome's sacred order in public. The breaking point came when he turned his attention to Rome's most sacred boundaries, its temples and its army. He ordered statues of himself placed inside temples, demanding worship as the empire's supreme deity. He even considered moving the capital of the empire to Alexandria in Egypt, where the tradition of god-kings might better support his delusions. To Romans steeped in the dignity of their republic-turned-empire, this was blasphemy of the highest order. It was no longer scandal, it was treason against Rome's soul. His behavior toward the military further fueled dissent. Caligula had once been adored by soldiers, the son of Germanicus, Rome's great general. But in his madness, he squandered their loyalty. Famously, he ordered his legions to march to the English Channel in preparation for a campaign against Britain, only to command them, once there, to collect seashells as the spoils of war. Soldiers obeyed, humiliated, realizing their emperor had mocked their discipline. For men who had bled in Germania and Spain, this was unforgivable. The military, once his shield, began to waver. Even within his chambers, cracks appeared. Stories spread of senators plotting quietly after being forced to watch their wives defiled. Noble women whispered of revenge after being paraded as prostitutes. Slaves carried gossip through the city, amplifying every rumor. The chambers that had silenced, Rome through terror, were now fueling rebellion with every performance of cruelty. The turning point was personal as well. Drusilla, his beloved sister and rumored consort, died unexpectedly in 38 CE. Caligula's grief pushed him further into instability. He deified her, declaring her a goddess, and some sources suggest he demanded public worship of her as his divine partner. But her death also stripped him of his closest ally, leaving his court colder, more hostile, and more dangerous. Without Drusilla's moderating influence, the emperor descended deeper into paranoia and excess. Rome reached its threshold in January of 41 CE. By then, the conspiracy had formed, a mix of senators and praetorian guards, men who had endured too much humiliation. They understood the risk. To kill a living emperor, proclaimed a god, was to risk annihilation. But to endure him any longer was impossible. The palace, once a stage for Caligula's dominance, became the chosen site of betrayal. The assassination itself was as brutal as the life that preceded it. Accounts differ, but most agree it occurred after a series of games in the theatre. Caligula retired to a passage beneath the palace. There, members of his own guard turned on him. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorians whom Caligula had mocked for effeminacy, struck the first blow. Daggers followed, stabbing him dozens of times until the god emperor was reduced to broken flesh on the marble floor. His wife and young daughter were slaughtered soon after, the blood of the imperial family staining the chambers where so many others had bled humiliation. In that moment, Rome reclaimed its boundaries. The chambers that had symbolized unrestrained power ended in screams and blood. The turning point was complete. The emperor, who had made himself god, was cut down by mortal hands, undone not by foreign armies, but by the very men sworn to protect him. And yet, the story did not end with his death. For even in assassination, Caligula's shadow lingered. His name became synonymous with excess and horror. The empire itself learned a brutal lesson that unchecked taboos could destroy even the most absolute rule, because in every society there comes a moment when indulgence becomes madness, when spectacle becomes outrage, and when power, unchecked, devours itself. For Caligula, that moment arrived not in the whispers of scandal, but in the slash of daggers, a bloody conclusion to a reign that had turned pleasure into terror. When Caligula's broken body hit the marble floor, Rome exhaled, but not with relief alone. His death left a trail of fear, shame, and unanswered questions. The emperor who had made pleasure into punishment was gone, yet the memory of his chambers would haunt the empire for centuries. The consequences of his reign extended far beyond scandal. They reshaped politics, morality, and the way history itself remembered power. The first consequence was immediate: instability. Caligula left no clear successor. His sudden assassination created a dangerous vacuum, with the Praetorian guards scrambling to secure a replacement. They chose Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man thought weak and unthreatening. Yet Claudius's elevation underscored an uncomfortable truth. Rome was now ruled not by noble tradition, but by whoever controlled the swords closest to the emperor. Caligula's excesses had revealed just how fragile the imperial system truly was. Politically, his scandals forced Rome to confront the dangers of unchecked power. The Senate, humiliated for years, briefly dreamed of restoring the Republic, but the dream collapsed quickly. The people had grown accustomed to an emperor's rule. What remained instead was a new caution. Future emperors, even those as cruel as Nero or Domitian, learned to mask their excesses, to bury their taboos beneath layers of theatre and propaganda. Caligula had shown what happened when an emperor stripped away all illusions: rebellion, betrayal, and death. Morally, his reign provoked a backlash. Writers and philosophers began to emphasize self-control, restraint, and the dangers of lust. Unbound, Stoic philosophers like Seneca found new audiences, their warnings about passion as a corrosive force sounding eerily prophetic. For the Roman elite, Caligula became the archetype of indulgence turned into madness. He was invoked as a cautionary tale, proof that empires could rot from within, not only from barbarian threats without. Religiously, his claim to divinity left scars. While emperors before him flirted with godhood, Caligula's arrogance in demanding living worship pushed boundaries too far. His placement of his image in temples was remembered not as piety, but as sacrilege. Later, emperors still demanded cults, but they cloaked their divinity in subtler rituals. Caligula's excesses taught Rome that gods could not be parodied without consequence. The gods themselves, or at least their priests, might tolerate indulgence, but not open mockery. The consequences extended into daily culture as well. Romans became more cynical about their leaders. Gossip, already a pastime, now carried sharper edges. Every scandal of later emperors, Nero's rumored affairs, Commodus's debaucheries, was filtered through the shadow of Caligula. His name became shorthand for sexual depravity, madness, and cruelty. To be compared to Caligula was to be branded a monster. Archaeology offers fragments that confirm the stories. Graffiti in Pompeii mocks emperors' lusts, as if echoing the whispers once muttered in Rome's streets. Coins from Caligula's reign, once bearing his proud image, were defaced or melted down, as though Romans themselves wished to erase his presence from memory. Yet the records of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus ensured that he could never truly be forgotten. History itself conspired to preserve his horrors as a warning. The long-term impact is clear. Caligula's reign hardened Rome against vulnerability. Emperors would continue to indulge their appetites, but few dared to flaunt them as he had. The pleasure chambers had become a parable, a story Rome told itself about the danger of absolute power, a reminder of how quickly fear could turn to rebellion. And yet, his legacy lingers even now. Modern historians debate whether some accounts were exaggerated, written by enemies eager to blacken his name. But even if only half the stories were true, the consequences remain the same. Caligula embodied the nightmare of power unrestrained. His chambers showed that intimacy could be the sharpest weapon, and shame the deadliest poison. In the end, the empire endured. Rome survived Caligula, but it did so scarred, wary, and haunted by the memory of an emperor who turned pleasure into tyranny. Because sometimes the greatest impact of a ruler is not in what he built, but in the horrors he left behind. The story of Caligula's pleasure chambers is not only a tale of ancient excess, it is a mirror reflecting truths that echo across time. His reign ended in blood, his body butchered by those he once commanded. Yet, his legacy lives on as one of history's most notorious warnings. He showed Rome, and us, what happens when desire is stripped of restraint, when pleasure becomes cruelty, and when power feeds on humiliation. The horrors of his chambers were not confined to Rome's marble halls. They exposed a universal danger, that intimacy, when weaponized, becomes a tool sharper than any sword. Caligula understood this instinctively. By humiliating senators, desecrating noble families, and flaunting incest and sacrilege, he turned the private into the public, the forbidden into the political. The empire endured, but it never forgot. His name still whispers across centuries, synonymous with madness, excess, and forbidden lust. And yet, in every age, the shadows of Caligula's chambers resurface. Modern politics reels from scandals where sex and power collide, leaders toppled by affairs, celebrities destroyed by exploitation, institutions shaken by secrets dragged into the light. We like to believe we are more civilized, more restrained than the ancients. But are we? Our fascination with scandal, Our hunger for forbidden knowledge, our obsession with those who wield power over desire, all suggest that Caligula's Rome is closer than we admit. Archaeologists still unearth fragments of his world. Coins defaced with his image, writings etched with bitterness, ruins that once held his decadent feasts. Yet the greatest ruins are invisible. The scars on Rome's collective memory, the reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humiliated by one man's appetite. So we are left with questions. What other secrets lie buried in history's shadows? How many rulers, forgotten or erased, indulged in horrors we cannot yet imagine? And most disturbingly, when scandal erupts in our own time, are we truly outraged or secretly entertained, just as the Romans were by the whispered tales of Caligula's chambers? The lesson of Caligula is not only about